Welcome, grasshoppers, as we do a quick intro to Ivanchuk move by move. Although I can't say that this was the first game whereby I noticed Ivanchuk. I first noticed him when he won the New York Open of 1988, where Grandmaster Ron Henley at the wall chart was looking at his remarkable score as he progressed through the tournament undefeated. I think it was 8-0. I'm not sure if it was 9 rounds yet in those days. But needless to say, Grandmaster Ron Henley with his southern drawl. Good morning, Ron. Grandmaster Ron Henley with his Texas drawl was noted to have been quoted as saying, "Who is this Ivanchuk fellow anyway?" As he was a non-titled player, might have been an IM at most at the time. And he came to the United States and he plowed through the former Heraldica Imports organizer, Jose Cucci's event, the New York Open 1988. And it was held at the Penta Hotel on 34th and 7th, across from Madison Square Garden. And there were many notable tournaments at that hotel, and many notable tournaments continued to be held well after the New York Open had left it. So, despite his notoriety and appeal at the time, it was very important and very impressive how he had such a wide range of openings, and he played in a number of ways that never ceased to amaze or impress. In this particular game, he opens very casually against Alexei Shirov, who is a very notable firebrand himself, Vasily Ivanchuk. Now, the next move that Ivanchuk plays, knight to c3, allows a very controversial gambit by black involving e5. And it's the number one reason why today many players begin with knight f3, knight f6, and only then do they play knight to c3. But as it turns out, since in the position after c6, Ivanchuk plays the move knight c3, inviting Shirov into the massive complications of e5, some of which I will not necessarily expound upon here, but Ivanchuk himself has played this particular move as black. So that after d takes e5, d4, knight to e4, queen a5 check, bishop d2, queen takes e5, and knight to g3. Now, one should note that this is a very, very precarious position for both sides. Personally, when I had prepared this particular variation as black, I had planned on playing h5 a la Richard Reti against, let's just say, an early knight g3 and another opening variation against the Caro-Kann, basically in the same position against the Caro-Kann. After e4, c6, d4, d5, knight d2, knight takes d2, knight f6, knight g3, h5 is a very common refutation of white's passive play. And although there's nothing wrong with this line can be played by both sides. It is relatively equal. Let's clobber this particular one for a moment and head toward more English-speaking music as we return to our game continuation after d4. d5, c4 is the only real way to test whether or not your opponent has the mettle to have put the time in studying a certain amount of opening theory. That is, you either holding the center, giving up the center, or fighting for the center. With the Queen's Gambit declined, you're commonly holding the center. The Queen's Gambit accepted, of course, would be an example of giving up the center. Knight to c3, black could fight for the center, as we just noted with e5, but instead chooses the standard knight f6, knight f3, and then e6, leading to what's commonly known today as the triangle variation. It's also known as the Semi-Slav, and it is highly recommended in Sam Shanklin's repertoire for black. And it commonly involves knight on b to d7, bishop d6, and holding the center and playing for the e5 break at a later date, possibly a c5 break. In this particular example, Ivanchuk shows no fear as he plays bishop to g5, inviting the complications of the anti-Meran. The Meran defense is the other name for this triangle defense, played in Murano, or at least popularized in Murano, Italy, which is why it's called the Meran variation. The anti-Meran systems involving bishop to g5 invite black to hang on to the pawn after c4, d takes c4, e4, and b5. And in this particular case, we have a very dynamic situation where white must follow through on his ideas in order to obtain any edge at all, that is e5. Black can, of course, break the pin on the knight by counterattacking the bishop. And by counterattacking the bishop, forcing it back, black pursues his counterattack with g5, and this brings about the famous Botvinnik variation. Knight takes g5. Now, it should be noted that in this position, black cannot play a move like knight to d5 and expect to capitalize on the pin on the bishop on h4, because white has a very dynamic move here in the form of knight takes f7, which was played by one of my students when their opponent tried exactly this. Queen takes h4 is somewhat forced. Knight takes h8. And bishop to b4 obtains a sufficient amount of counterplay to avoid being lost. However, if white keeps their composure and just defends against the attack on c3, and black, of course, will probably try to take advantage of the situation in two ways, either with the move c5 or the far more commonly thought to be stronger queen to e4 check. And in this manner, we're prevented from castling because of the threat of queen takes g2 check. But at the same time, things have become highly, highly unclear. And this all resulted from, after the move, knight takes g5, knight to d5, knight takes f7. This is just one of the many branches of theory that we're probably not going to try to get too much into so deeply. But the recapture and the bishop capturing forces black to defend the knight in some fashion or another. Both bishop e7 and knight on b to d7 can be played here. The far more popular move is knight on b to d7. And there's no rush to take the knight on f6. Basically, in this particular position, white commonly continues with g3, and after bishop to b7, bishop to g2, queen to b6 guards the bishop and prepares to move c5. And it's only now that the queen has disappeared from the f6 square that white might continue, or should continue, and must continue with e takes f6. And this will transpose to our game. Going back, in this particular position, after knight on b to d7, Ivanchuk chooses e takes f6 straight away. And with black gaining control of the long diagonal, in theory, basically we can still play g3, as c5 is met by d5, closing the center and attempting to open up lines against the king that's in the center. Now, Vasily Ivanchuk, an extremely dynamic player, has looked at these opening lines and worked on his calculation and his assessments of the position very deeply in order to continue developing the pieces and possibly to get his king safe. The next natural move is queen to b6, bishop to g2, and after black castles queenside, white castles kingside. You can already note that white has a protected passed pawn that could eventually be a threat on the h-file. So black does have to do quite a bit of a dance here to get something moving. Therefore, the first dynamic move that black plays is b4. Now, there are two continuations today. There is the continuation that Ivanchuk played, which is knight a4, or there is the later thought to be even more dynamic, but perhaps not as good move, rook to b1, a passive sacrifice of the knight to open up lines to get at the b7 bishop. Ivanchuk, though, the year is 1994, plays the standard continuation as rook to b1 was introduced later by Kramnik. Ivanchuk continues with knight a4, and the queen tags that knight. And now white begins trying to open up lines toward the black king that is sitting precariously on the open c-file, or the semi-open c-file. Now, in this particular position, b3 is probably the best move for black, just to keep the lines closed and to cut off the defense of the knight, even though the knight might return to c3. The black king will feel a little bit safer here. However, Shirov, in an effort to create counterplay against the white queen, more than likely on the open d-file, plays bishop takes d5, and after bishop takes d5, Shirov begins lighting the board on fire with knight to e5. Now remember, white does have an extra minor piece here, as white has two bishops and a knight, while black has only a bishop and a knight. So this gives us an opportunity to examine many continuations in reply. Bishop takes e6 check, for example. Where is our timer? One moment before we go much further. Make sure that our timer is available, as we're going to be asking for some cooperation and contributions by white. We're going to look for candidate moves here for white. Now you may pause this for just a moment if you're watching the video on demand. candidate moves for white. And in reality, the reason why I try to limit it to 45 seconds to 1 minute is that you're not looking for the best move. You're looking for all the possible moves that you might play in this particular situation. For example, the knight on a4 is limited in movement. We might look for the worst placed pieces, the best placed pieces. We might look for threats, checks, captures that fit the bill. We might look for where are the weaknesses, what are the best and worst placed pieces we already addressed, but most of all we have to consider what is the opponent's intention. So in this particular instance, black has considerable counterplay on the king side, and the three strongest moves in this position are, in order, the move Ivanchuk played, queen to e2, knight takes c5, desperadoing the badly placed knight on a4, and a takes b4, opening up the a file. Now all of these moves are really a matter of taste, as any one of them could lead to the desired result. After a takes b4, rook takes d5 is the most logical reply. And after knight takes c5, bishop takes c5, a takes b4 continues to open up the lines on the queen, as well as the weakened pawn on a7. Black has an opportunity to desperado his bishop, move his queen out of the way, possibly with check, and try to batten down his king side. And this position is roughly level, a little bit better for white. So after the move e5, Ivanchuk goes for the counter-attacking toward the unprotected knight on e5, queen e2. After all, the knight on a4 does not need to be protected just yet. After all, black can capture two pieces, and he does choose to do so. He captures at least one, leaving the knight on a4 in the lurch. Therefore, a takes b4, c takes b4. Knight to c3 is a good discovery on the queen. So what to do? Well, sacrifice the exchange, of course, as we have a tremendous mass of pawns. We have queen to d6, as well as the move played by Ivanchuk, Ivanchuk's opponent, Alexei Shirov, in the game, queen to c6. Now, interestingly enough, if the queen had gone to d6, it may have more or less given white an additional tempo by playing knight e4. So therefore, Shirov chooses queen to c6 in an effort to perhaps limit white's options. And white chooses in this instant perhaps the second best move. Knight takes d5. Bishop f4 could also have been considered, possibly the best move. In any event, after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, there is a very serious threat to our white squares now. On f3, Ivanchuk battens down the white squares with f3, allowing bishop to c5 check. Is this our game, or is this a different game? 1 second here. This is not our game. Take a quick peek. Oh, silly me. This is just one of many drubbings by Alexei Shirov, or by Vasily Ivanchuk toward Alexei Shirov, and it will be a great precursor to the game that we're about to see. As after king to g2, knight to d3, black has a very strongly placed knight, and Ivanchuk's counterplay must consist of the pass to h-pawn. King to b7 battens down the queen side, while rook to a5 threatens to both double rooks, pin the bishop on c5 to the queen, and of course black needs to create some form of counterplay. So he unpins his queen. Unpins his bishop by moving his queen. And in this particular case, white continues to try to remove the defenders. Note that after the move b3, if c takes b3, rook takes c5, knight takes c5 would run into queen b5 check, so therefore queen takes c5 and queen takes d3 would ensue. So, once more, black seeks counterplay against white's major pieces. Rook to a2. Now black has a protected passed pawn, and one might wonder what in the world is going on here, right? Rook to d1. Rook to d8 is somewhat forced. After all, that knight was not only pinned, but attacked twice. And now Ivanchuk presses on with h5. And this is becoming very, very threatening. The only source of counterplay black has, shoving his a-pawn. a5, g4, and this allows a little bit of counterplay on black's part as he gives back the exchange, or he recovers his exchange with knight to f4 check. Bishop takes f4, queen takes d1. But we're in a straightforward endgame here with rook and bishop versus rook. Queen takes d1, rook takes d1, h6. Note that the bishop is controlling the queening square c1. The king is controlling the square h1 to keep the rook from falling behind it. So, as a result, black seeks to improve his king position and perhaps even get his pawns moving. Now, it's at this moment that Shirov flinches just a little bit. Things could already be looking a little sad for him as the threat of g6, f7, and h7 are coming in with the help of bishop to h6 and bishop to g7. So therefore, Shirov runs back to try to stop the onslaught of the pawns. White improves his king position toward the center, or at least toward these dangerous passed pawns, while simultaneously allowing his rook to reach the squares behind the passed pawns. Bishop to d4 in an effort to stop the move g6 and to bolster the square h8. King to e2, note the improvement of the king. e5, and now Ivanchuk has a very serious decision on his hands as to where to place his bishop, whether he's going to allow the exchange or to continue covering with bishop to c1, which may well be the most logical move. However, he wishes to get his king onto a better square, so he chooses bishop to e3. And black's bishop, of course, has no reason to feel threatened. Although improving the king position could well be in order, capturing the bishop in order to keep the cutoff is also in order. But at the same time, he could just place his rook on a h8 if he so desired, try to keep these pawns immobilized, and he can capture on e3 at any time. Shirov chooses to move king to b5, which is perfectly understandable. And now things seem to be going a little bit toward the worst. After bishop takes d4, black would easily create some counterplay with a rook to d4 and get his rook behind the passed pawns. After all, can he stop them? Chances are not. However, instead of bishop takes d4, which could well be the best move, Ivanchuk chooses the next best move, h7, which threatens all of the above. And this leads us to defending against the pawn promoting. Bishop takes d4, e takes d4, g6 is somewhat forced, and the only way that we can keep our pawn on h7 from being captured is to play f7. And in this manner, black's king needs perhaps to assist in the defense. King to b5, king to c6 was played, and Ivanchuk, of course, improves his rook position, prepares after king to d7, rook to e2 to promote his pawns and to pick off everything that black owns. a4, once again, this is black's continuation for counterplay. However, it falls just a little bit short as it can be ignored. Rook to e8, a takes b3, rook takes h8, b2, and now black to move. I'm sorry, white to move. Candidate moves for white. There are many moves at work here. A couple of the moves are faster and more direct than others. Amazingly enough, almost everything leads to checkmate for white in this position. Yes, that's correct. There are 4 moves in this position that all lead to mate. Again, you're looking for all of the good moves in the position, and from those good moves, you're hoping to find a better move, perhaps even the best move than the first move you might normally play, and this is how you will seek improvement in your game. Ivanchuk chose the most forceful move. Rook to d8 check, and Alexei Shirov resigned in this position. As it turns out, the king might be able to move away, but in any event, the pawns can be stymied a little bit with king to c2, which was also a very good move in the previous position, but rook to d8 check was the fastest move leading to mate, putting the king on a square where we can ignore the pushing of the pawns. King c2, c2 check, king takes, and literally there's nothing black can do here but desperado all of his material in order to stymie off further defeat. There's nothing he can do. After all, the pawn is queening and the game is over. Now, this game was played in 1994, and Vasily Ivanchuk was now becoming one of the world's best players, and we were going to follow his journey considerably more. Even in this variation, we're going to follow up yet again with even more amazing chess by Vasily Ivanchuk. Thank you for watching. Quadraspassky. Sorry, Chris, you didn't get rid of me that easily. However, we are going to send you back over to Jabava for a moment, or maybe we'll send you over to Olborta. Peter Fiddler is doing his routine in the Mr. Dodgy Invitational. Thanks everyone for watching. Cheers and ciao. Hopefully we'll have a few viewers ready and willing to cross over so that it won't just be me. We'll return in a moment with Shirov versus Ivanchuk Part 2 of Iconsay 1996, the game that makes the greatest impression on the future creativity of Vasily Ivanchuk. Cheers and ciao. Thank you, Roken. Oh, let's give Kingslayer Sloan a quick shout out for those of you who haven't already followed him. I'll be back in roughly 5 minutes to continue the series of Move by Ivanchuk, gifted by Ron Hay to the dojo through the Amazon wishlist. Cheers and ciao. Thank you very much.